Hello, in this video we're going to talk about the topic of pornography in the Bible. This is something that I've seen come up a lot lately in the comments section, so I thought I'd carve out some time in the schedule to go ahead and address it. Typically when Muslims bring this up, they're talking about Ezekiel 23, which reads, "She played the whore in the land of Egypt and lusted after her lovers there, whose members were like those of donkeys and whose issue was like that of horses." Now what I'm going to do in this video is spend a little time addressing this polemic, not very much because anyone with half a brain can see what's going on here in Ezekiel. Of course, Muslims don't want to think through this. They just want to have their polemic. So we're going to spend a little bit of time there, but then treat it sort of like Isaiah 42, where we address the misunderstanding, and then we move on to talk about some things that are actually worth talking about. We won't do any in-depth exegesis. It'll be just a few interesting things about Ezekiel that for some of you may want to look into a little bit more. So before we address the polemic and then move on to some actually interesting things that are worth talking about, let's expose first the hypocrisy of the Muslims. When they talk about sexually explicit language in the Bible, what about their texts? Let's take a look. "And Mary, daughter of Imran, whose body was chaste," protected her private part, "therefore we breathed therein something of our spirit." Well, where exactly did you breathe this in, Jibreel? Tafsir ibn Kathir helps us out. "Allah commanded Jibreel to blow into a gap of her garment, and that breath went into her womb through her private part. So Isa, whoever Isa is, was conceived when Jibreel blew into her private part." Not a problem, though, if it's in the Islamic text. There's no problem with Sahih al-Bukhari talking about the male organs of Muhammad's companions dribbling with reproductive fluid. There's no issue with Aisha having to wash traces of semen from the clothes of Muhammad. And of course, in Paradise Women here, you have something to look forward to. You'll have desirable front passages. And men, you'll have a male member that never becomes flaccid. So these texts aren't a problem if they're in the Islamic text for Muslims. Not a problem at all, but of course, it's a problem if it's in the Bible. Now, I started off this video with a quote from Ezekiel chapter 23. That's typically where Muslims go. However, they only go there because they don't know Hebrew. If they knew Hebrew, they would recognize that Ezekiel 16 is probably the most sexually explicit chapter in the Bible. Let's look at a couple of examples just from the English translation. From Ezekiel 16:25, "At the head of every street you have built your lofty place and made your beauty an abomination, offering yourself to any passerby and multiplying your whoring. You also took your beautiful jewels of my gold and of my silver which I had given you, and made for yourselves images of men, and with them played the whore." Now, the Hebrew here refers to spreading legs in the first verse that we mentioned, and then subsequently perhaps even fashioning phallic shapes and then performing sexual acts with those phallic shapes. Are you disgusted yet? Well, good, because if you are, then you may be better off in some ways than the exiles. God is casting the sin of his people in the worst possible language to give them an idea of the way he feels about their sin, their prolonged sin, and it's cast in the worst, most explicit language to show that not only did Israel sin, and not only did they sin for a prolonged period of time, but their appetite for sin was insatiable. They had all that they could take, and then what would they do? They would spread their legs for more. Now we have contextual clues, both from the semantics of the language here in Ezekiel 16, as well as clues from the historical context, that God is not fond of this stuff. So you have, again, the word of the Lord came to me, "Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations." Okay, to'ivaz, the Hebrew there, abominations, detestable things. Okay, that's how God describes the actions of his people. So you know, if you're literate, from Ezekiel 16, that God does not approve of this stuff. What about the historical context? I mean, where is Ezekiel? When the book of Ezekiel opens, we find Ezekiel in the 13th year in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, "as I was among the exiles." Catch that, the exiles, "by the Kavar Canal." Now, where's the Kavar Canal? Well, it's in Babylon, with the other exiles. God's covenant people, the southern kingdom, what's left, is in exile because of their prolonged apostasy, their insatiable appetite for sin, which is described graphically in Ezekiel 16, again, to give us a taste for the way God views this stuff. Now, you would expect, after Ezekiel 16, with all of the language and the way that sin is described, that God would say something like, "And by the way, I'm going to grind you into dust." But he doesn't. he says something else. From verses 62 and 63, I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord, that you may remember and be confounded, and never open your mouth again because of your shame, when I atone for you for all that you have done, declares the Lord God. And this is how the God of the Bible works. There's a balance between judgment, love, forgiveness, mercy, and all of these divine attributes. Can you look at Ezekiel here and say that God condones of this sexually explicit language which describes the sin of his people? Absolutely not. You can't do it semantically. You can't do it historically. Can you say that God ignores sin? Absolutely not. Because the setting, once again, is among the exiles. God's people are being judged for their sin. But can you say that God is not forgiving? No, because the message here at the end of Ezekiel 16 is one of reconciliation. And in the bigger picture, the message is of reconciliation and restoration as well in Ezekiel chapter 40 and following to the end of the book. God's judgment is for a purpose, and that purpose is to restore the relationship between him and his people that is broken by sin. There's a passage that comes to mind from Romans, where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. And that's the message here in Ezekiel chapter 16. You come face to face with a graphic realization of sin, how disgusting it is in God's eyes, but you also come face to face with the forgiveness of God. It's a wonderful thing. Now, what are some other interesting things that we can pull out of Ezekiel here? The polemics over with, we're thinking people. We understand what's going on here in the text. I'd like to point out just a couple of other things. From Ezekiel 16, the forgiveness of God. Let's just, for fun, jump into Ezekiel 1 really quickly. Ezekiel has a vision here, and we have a lot of really what could be confusing imagery. Okay, so you have living creatures. Now, these creatures are later clarified to be cherubim from Ezekiel chapter 10. Their wings touched one another. You have 4 of them. And then you have this talk of rims and wheels within wheels. What is going on here? What is Ezekiel seeing? Well, if you read the description of Solomon's temple, you find some interesting parallels, and you realize that all Ezekiel's done is he has compressed the description of Solomon's temple into just a couple of short verses here in Ezekiel 1. Let's look at some parallels. From 1 Chronicles 28, you get the golden chariot of the cherubim. Of course, there's chariot talk in Ezekiel chapter 1. And for those of you who know, this is actually where the term Merkavah occurs. From 1 Kings chapter 6, there are 2 cherubim, and we know that there are 2 also with the Ark of the Covenant, so that would be a total of 4, just like we have in Ezekiel chapter 1. And then you get the same talk that occurs in Ezekiel chapter 1 about their wings touching each other. And then we have more descriptions of the furnishings of the temple here and the chariot throne in 1 Kings 7. 4 wheels, axles of the wheels. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel with their axles and their rims, their spokes, and their hubs, etc. So what's the point of all this? Well, I bring it up because it tells us something about Ezekiel and it tells us something about God. For one thing, Ezekiel was a bold spokesman for God, because the gods of the ancient Near East were territorial. Okay, so the Babylonians would have seen in the fact that Babylon defeated the southern kingdom. This would have been viewed in ancient Near Eastern terms as the God of Israel losing to the gods of Babylon, or at least the God of Israel passively giving them up to the gods of Babylon. Gods were very territorial, and Ezekiel now is no longer in the borders of Israel. Ezekiel's in Babylon. He's by the Kavar Canal with the rest of the exiles. Ezekiel could get in trouble for declaring that God is still sovereign. Ezekiel could get in trouble for offering this condensed picture of the temple of God on his throne above the earth. God is sovereign. What about Marduk? What about the other gods that the Babylonians worshipped? Ezekiel doesn't seem to care much. We don't see any hesitation in Ezekiel's call like perhaps we see with Moses. Of course, it's understandable. Moses had to go before Pharaoh. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to do what Ezekiel did, and that is proclaim this vision that he saw to his contemporaries, because he could have gotten in some pretty deep water there at the Kavar Canal. The Babylonians might not have taken too kindly to his description of God as sovereign over the earth, but God is sovereign, and even in this case, where God has let his people go into exile, this would have been a message of hope for some of Ezekiel's contemporaries, the other exiles. God is still sovereign. He's in control. He's enthroned over the earth. He goes anywhere he wants. He's the king. God is sovereign. So we see God's sovereignty here. We see the fearlessness of Ezekiel as he courageously proclaims the message. And then, of course, in Ezekiel chapter 16, we see God's forgiveness. So I hope that's at least interesting for some of you if you want to pursue these areas a little bit further. And I think that adequately addresses the polemic about the sexually explicit language in the Bible. So thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.